Hello everyone. In this demo, we're going to take a look at writing two different functions. One is going to be used for a calculation. We'll just use a function that calculates the surface area of a circular cylinder using its radius and its height. And I'd like to show you an example of using a function whose return type is bool that can be used to check for valid input. Again, keep in mind the bool values are either true or false, and you can write functions for input validation checks. It's a nice style to sometimes use. You'll notice that we have a lot of stuff already set up here. We have the prompt lines for radius and height and main. There's a do while loop to let us go again. So we can begin by making our two function declarations. So the one for the surface area would return numerical value. We'll say double for the precision of that. And we'll simply give it a name of cylinder SA for surface area. And it would need to take two values as input, one for the radius and one for the height. So I'm going to go with double R for the radius and double H for the height. I already used the names radius and height in main, and I could definitely use them again for the function's formal parameters, but it's a good idea to have different names when you're first beginning with functions, just to be clear in your mind of the difference between the values in main that are being used to take the user's input and pass those values along to the formal parameters of the function, which we'll call R and H here. And the other function is going to check for valid input, so it will still take in a radius and a height, but its return type is going to be something either true or false. True if we get valid input and false otherwise, which would go with the return type of bool. We'll simply call it isValid, and we'll say double R and double H. Also good to provide a comment to these function declarations just to describe what each function does. So we'll put a quick comment above each one. We'll say this one calculates the surface area of a cylinder using the radius and height. And this one checks for valid radius and height values. Okay, great. Now at this point, we can copy and paste each of these declarations and begin to write our function definitions for each one. So remember, delete the semicolon, then bring in the block of code for the function definition body. And same thing with our isValid function here. Delete the semicolon from that declaration and then open and closing brace for the function body. Now for the surface area one, I'm going to use the style of declaring a variable that has the same type as the return type, assigning a value to that variable, and then returning the name of that variable. It's a good habit for writing functions that return values, and we'll stick with that here. We'll say double SA for surface area, assign the surface area appropriately, and then return the value of that surface area variable. Surface area of a circular cylinder is based on the two circular bases. So it'd be 2 pi r squared, and then the circumference by height rectangle that goes around the sides, that's 2 pi r h. So we'll just write that in C++. So it's 2 times pi, we'll just use 3.14159. And I feel like using the pow function here. So we'll raise the radius parameter to the second power. Now to be clear, I have to write things in terms of these formal parameters. So it should be r, 2 and not radius, 2. Again, radius, its scope, so to speak, the place where you can access that variable is only the main part of the function. I have to make sure I'm writing my function in terms of its formal parameters, which in this case would be r and h. And for the other part of the cylinder, the other face would do 2 times pi again, times the radius value times the height value. And again, notice you have to use these formal parameter names of r and h. I also brought in the pow function, and I do not believe we had the hash include CMAF, so we'll go back up top and put that in. Okay, so it should be good for our surface area calculation. Now for the function that checks for valid input, we're going to do this with an if-else statement. Valid input would be both the r and h values here would be greater than 0, otherwise we get invalid input. So we'll say if r is greater than 0 and h is greater than 0, we're going to return true, the keyword true for getting valid input, else we'll return false, meaning our input is invalid. And you'll see how we actually use this function to control a heading of either an if statement or a loop in main. It's a nice style for checking for valid input using a function. Okay, at this point, I feel like building this to see if everything's going well. So enter the cylinder radius 5, enter the height 2, and run it again, nope. So it seems like our syntax is good. We can now begin to add some calls to each function. So let's begin by just checking with a call to that cylinder surface area function that we get a reasonable output for a surface area. We're just going to put that within a cout statement. We'll say cout the surface area of the cylinder is, and we'll just put the function call within this cout statement. We'll make a call to cylinder SA, and keep in mind we have to plug in the arguments for radius and height, and we'd be plugging in the values of these radius and height variables in the order in which they appear in that function heading too. So it's radius before height. We'll do radius, comma, height. And to be clear, we have to use the names of these variables in main that actually hold on to the values we want to plug in. Radius and height, whatever their values are, they'll get plugged into those formal parameters R and H, and then the function does its computations. Okay, so let's check with that same radius and height value. So 5 for the radius, 2 for the height. Surface area of the cylinder is 219.911. Seems reasonable. And run it again. No. So now, this is all well and good, but it does presume we have valid input. And this is where our isValid function can come in. We can use this to control either an input validation loop or even a simple if-else pair that displays output if radius and height were valid, and then prints a message to the effect of an error if it was not. We're going to use the style of using an if-else pair here. We're going to say if our input's valid, we'll display the actual surface area. Else, we'll say the user made an error. And this program allows repeating anyway, so they'll get a second chance to input. It's a little bit different style than what we're used to, where we'd follow each one with its own individual loop. But this is a very good style as well, because it's going to give them the opportunity to go again if we have this repeating question at the end. So to use that isValid function, what usually goes in an if statement heading is some kind of Boolean expression that's true or false. Well, isValid returns a value that's either true or false. So you can put a call to isValid as the if statement heading. If our radius and height values are true when they're plugged into isValid, let's display the surface area. Else, we'll display an error message. So this call isValid radius, comma, height plugs in the values for radius and height the user puts in, passes them along to isValid, which determines if we should say true or false for the valid values. So if both user inputs were positive, we'll get back a true value. This if statement will run. Otherwise, we'll see this error message that we're about to put in. So we'll say cout invalid input detected. Please run again. So a little bit different style than we're used to using with the while loop that follows each one. You can definitely have isValid as the control at a while loop following both sets of input as well. But given the fact this program already allows repeating, I think this is another acceptable style to use for checking for valid input. So let's run this with the same two valid input values, 5 and 2. That if statement should definitely operate. Okay, good, it did. Now let's run this program again with maybe taking -5 and 2. So you'll notice the call to isValid returned false. -5 was being used as the value of radius. Gets plugged in down here for that formal parameter. That r greater than 0 is not true. Therefore, the function returns false. And we're seeing that error message print out in that else case. And it lets us go again. So let's see, do you want to run again? Sure. And oops. So let's run this one more time, I guess. Enter the radius, we'll say -3 and 2. Input, invalid, run it again, yes, 3 and 2. And gives us a good surface area there. So that's just how to use a function with a return type of bool. It's kind of the new takeaway from this demo. Feel free to start using that as your style. It's a nice, very readable way to know what's happening in that if statement heading. Let's make a call to this bool function that's valid. And if we get back a valid radius and height, we can print out the correct result. Otherwise, say there was an error. Okay, hope this demo was helpful.